Good afternoon, everyone. It's a perfectly weathered day to talk about Northern Europe. So I hope everyone is in a Northern Europe frame of mind. Welcome. My name is Heather Conley. I'm Senior Vice President here at CSIS, and we are extremely excited to release a new report. It's entitled Enhanced Deterrence in the North, a 21st Century European Engagement Strategy. We could not be more grateful to have such an extraordinary group of colleagues with us this afternoon to help us explore how to strengthen regional deterrence and defense in the North. This journey took us to many capitals, and we had an opportunity to speak to many experts. We started in Oslo, Stockholm, then Helsinki. We wound our way through Brussels, and then came to Washington to have a robust discussion of not only Russia's defense capabilities to the present, and we extended out for the next decade, but to also look at a very complex web of security relationships in Northern Europe, and then to make some assessments. But before I turn to our wonderful colleagues who will help us roll up our sleeves and dig into what exactly we mean about deterrence and strengthening deterrence in the North, I wanted to give you a very brief snapshot of the key findings of our report. Basically, I'm going to compress 40 pages in 2 minutes, so please bear with me. The first thing what I want you to know about this report is our definition of Northern Europe. We see the North Atlantic, the Barents, and the Baltic Seas as one interconnected theater of operation. This is how our adversary thinks and exercises. I think perhaps we should think about it in similar ways. And for far too long, the United States and our European colleagues have siloed these regions. We talk about the Baltic Sea. We talk about the North Atlantic. Every once in a while, we talk about the Barents Sea and the Arctic, but rarely do we think about them as a combined operation. The second thing that must be understood about our report is that we make the assumption that Sweden and Finland will not join NATO. I think the research community has spent a lot of time thinking about the what-ifs of potential membership and haven't really focused on the pragmatic ways to increase defense capabilities in the region. So after those two assumptions in place, and after assessing Russia's military capabilities over the next decade, the enhanced deterrence in the North has 6 key purposes. 1, strengthen regional deterrence. 2, strengthen regional reinforcement. 3, streamline existing structures. And I'll just pause for a moment and tell you what that means. You could look at the bilateral relationships, U.S.-Sweden defense cooperation. You could look at Norway-UK bilateral cooperation. You could look at trilateral cooperation, U.S.-Sweden-Finland. You could look at NORDEFCO, Nordic cooperation. You could look at Nordic-Baltic cooperation. You could look at Nordic-Baltic-U.S. cooperation. You could look at NATO and EU cooperation. Are you already tired? I'm already tired by talking about all of those. So there's so many structures. Which one to choose? In our report, we sort of came out on the side of the northern group, perhaps a group you aren't familiar with. It was initiated by the United Kingdom about 7 years ago to try to give some structure to this. And so we think a grouping of 12 countries, this is the UK, Poland, Germany, the 3 Baltic states, the 5 Nordic countries, and the Netherlands. As I like to say, it's sort of like the Hanseatic Defense League, but you get that concept of the northern group. The 4th key purpose was to address capability gaps in the region, to strengthen expeditionary capabilities. And where a lot of our report spends some meaningful time is to look at stronger regional air and maritime defenses. And quite frankly, we felt this is where the key challenges were. We think NATO in particular and the enhanced forward presence has done a very good job on land, but we have really neglected the air and the maritime components. So enhanced deterrence in the North is divided into 4 key components. We focus on command and control, which is actually absolutely vital as we think about all of these key areas. And in that, what we certainly strongly recommend, and it looks like NATO is getting ready to approve a third strategic command for the North Atlantic. We recommend in our report that that be based in Markham, which is the headquarters in the UK, and certainly to encourage the United Kingdom to have a leading and participating role in that strategic command. We also look at integrating Sweden and Finland more effectively into command and control operations. So command and control, a critical area of interest. The second, air. This is probably a little controversial. We transition from air policing, which is NATO's role right now with the Baltic states and over Iceland, and start thinking about addressing a transition to air defense. And this is principally to focus on Russia's growing cruise and short-range ballistic missile capabilities in the region. It's vital for these 12 countries to develop a common air picture. We would like to turn the Icelandic and Baltic air policing missions into a Northern European air defense. This, of course, would require significant upgrading to regional air bases. We would like to see how host nation support requirements could be enhanced, but this is already building on an agreement last November by Nordefco to do exactly that. We also think it's important to integrate regional air defense systems. There's great synergies in the Patriot systems that Sweden and Poland have purchased. Perhaps we could even look more closely at ways for surface-to-air missile integration. So we think there is also some good work to be done in UAVs. So how to enhance that air defense posture is very important. Third component, maritime. We've seen an extraordinary amount of maritime activity, both the submarine activity in the North Atlantic, but also very focused on undersea cables, whether they are in the Baltic Sea or even in the North Atlantic. So the maritime component focuses on, of course, anti-submarine warfare in the North Atlantic. We also encourage a Baltic Sea maritime component. We turn to Germany to be a leading framework nation for a Baltic Sea maritime component. Wouldn't Germany serve as the perfect NATO-EU bridge to help bring in Sweden and Finnish maritime capabilities as well as NATO? We'd also like to focus more on Coast Guard jointness. Perhaps a subgroup of the North Atlantic Coast Guard Forum could be of the northern group to, again, focus on Coast Guard activities. We've seen in Russian activity probing the coastal areas. How can we work more effectively with the Coast Guards? And then finally, working on unmanned undersea vehicles. How can we get ahead of the innovation and develop that thinking? Finally, land. Although the enhanced forward presence is certainly an important contribution, we'd like to see where the 300 U.S. Marine rotational force that is in Norway, perhaps that could be integrated into the United Kingdom's joint expeditionary forces, which will become operational this year. Could we incorporate Sweden and Finland, their land forces, into the NATO battalion construct in the Baltic states or in Poland? And of course, in order to do this, to make this a more robust expeditionary capability, we go back to an earlier recommendation that CSIS made several years ago, and looking at the future of U.S. force posture in Europe, the U.S. needs to return to a 4-brigade presence in Europe. And we'd love to see this region become an early adopter of what we call military Schengen, which is that rapid mobilization, how to ensure swift response and reaction. So that's very ambitious. A command and control, an air component, a maritime component, and then a beefing up a land component. And what we would love to see as NATO prepares for its major exercise this fall, Trident Juncture, which will be located in Norway, this would be a perfect time to exercise some of these new ideas. But at least it sets us on a very new course to think about enhanced deterrence in the North. So that's your abridged version of the report. Now let's get talking to the experts who can either say we got it right or say we got it wrong. Let me please introduce, and with great pleasure, General Phil Breedlove. You know him as, he almost needs no introduction, former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, former commander of U.S. European Command, a distinguished military leader who, previous to serving as SACEUR, was commander of U.S. Air Forces in Europe, commander of U.S. Air Forces in Africa, vice chief of staff of the U.S. Air Force. But Phil, the part I love about your resume, this guy clocked over 3,500 flying hours, mostly in an F-16. He gets it done. Please join me in welcoming General Phil Breedlove.
I'm always looking around to see who they're talking about. First of all, thank you to the organizers for having me here and giving me the opportunity. And frankly, I look forward to being on the stage with my fellow panelists, people I have the most respect for from my past today. So there'll be a couple of smart folks up here, and I'll be the ball and chain they drag behind them. The good news and the bad news. The good news is that my remarks were almost just given. And I say that because I am so happy with what I have read in this report so far. And a bit of that is selfish, because what I see in this is some of the themes that I carried for the last year of my time at SACEUR, and as we came out of Wales and started going toward Warsaw, the things that we were trying to work on. And so I happen to think this is really good work, and I intend to lend my shoulder to the plow and do what I can to help this along. And so what I want to do today, I was asked to speak briefly, and then we'll get to what we really want to do, which is address your questions and answers. But I want to just celebrate or talk about some themes that I think are consistent from where I have been and where this report goes, and to maybe add a little yes and to each one of those. I just returned a little over 2 weeks ago from a trip to all 3 Baltic nations, meeting with defense ministers and above, Poland, and then came out through Brussels. So I've had some conversations with leadership in these nations in the last 2 weeks on just the subjects that we're going to talk about today. So right out of the chute, it's inconceivable for me to think of NATO's north without thinking about Finland and Sweden. And so after many conversations with both of those chiefs of defense, and on occasion civilian leaders in their ministries of defense, it's clear that we all understand how tied we are to any action in the northern part of NATO's area of responsibility. And frankly, as I'll discuss in a few minutes, how any conflict would happen in that part of the world without Finland and Sweden being a part of that in some way or form is really hard for me to conceive. And so I think of 3 words when I think of these 2 nations. What are our policies and what are their policies? And what are we pushing on inside of NATO in order to make it easier for us to do the things that we need to do with Finland and Sweden? Are we putting up any barriers, any walls that make it harder for us to be a team if we have to be a team? To what degree can we plan together? As the SACEUR, I told them more than once, listen, we want to do everything that you can do right up to the point where you run into political issues or civilian control of the military issues in your response. And so we are willing to be a part of understanding, planning, and execution in that respect. And then in the day-to-day execution with these 2 nations, typically through exercises and other things, we should be enabling those interactions, vice not. Air and maritime integration is a must. As was mentioned, we're doing pretty good on the ground piece. We've still got some work to do, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But frankly, the air and maritime is where we've got a lot of work to do. And just establishing COPs, common operating pictures, just establishing those COPs is not as simple as you would think. One of the facts that I sort of knew, but I didn't understand the impact of it is, as I traveled the 3 Baltic nations, is that only one of those 3 CRCs or CRPs can generate the COP. And so if that one goes down at this moment, the other 2 may not be able to generate the COP, and certainly may not be able to connect to Finland and Sweden to get a larger air or maritime picture. And so we need to take a look at this. Even though these 2 nations, these great militaries, are not a part of our alliance, what I think you and I would both want to be able to happen is if a problem occurs, we are at the flip of a switch to make it work. To do that, we need the policies to get out there and try it. And to do that, we need to look at the technologies to make sure that our pictures are mating seamlessly and instantly when a policy decision is made to bring them together. So we have to be ready, both in the air and in the maritime COP, which Mark can talk more eloquently to in the Q&A. But we need to be able to make this happen instantly and not have to enter into a policy discussion when we need to have it happen. I've been saying for a long time, and I violently agree with this report, that we need to move from air policing to air defense. Frankly, we are not postured correctly. I do know what aviators do when they send on these missions. I've done these kind of missions. And we're going airborne with rules of engagement and special instructions which will leave our pilots absolutely short of the ability to make the decisions they need to make at speed when something happens in the air. We are in a posture that is dedicated to and built around a peacetime civilian renegade aircraft. Yet what we're encountering every day are bear bombers and fighters and other things doing more wartime practice-like missions. The 2 are not mated. We are making it work. We need to get past the point at which we would put one of our young pilots in a position where they do not have the understanding of what action they can take when they see a problem. We all understand that always on Baltic air policing missions, the pilots have the right of self-defense. How does that project to when the pilot or the NATO aircraft is not under threat, but the aircraft being observed is placing the land under threat? What rules of engagement will that pilot have when they see the doors opening for the missile to release, or the missile arming, or whatever it is? We don't prepare our pilots correctly because we're in the wrong posture, and I believe we need to move to that posture. It's another problem of having the policy done up front. If we wait until we're confronted with such an issue and then we start the discussion about the policy, we will be days, months, and weeks to the rear of the time we need a decision. So we need to be able to think through the problems now, get the hard policy decisions done, and then be able to react at speed. I'm going to say it just one more time, and I'm going to use a flying term. We're at 0G right now. 0G. Nobody's pulling hard on the stick. Nobody's sweating. Nobody's about to die. This is the time to make these hard decisions. We don't want to make these hard decisions when the Fulcrum and the F-16 are across the circle at 9 Gs getting ready to fire a missile. The Baltic Sea. We need to have a conversation about what denied means. If you watch our exercises, it's interesting to see what our forces do in reaction to the A2AD, anti-access area denial capability in Kaliningrad. Do we make decisions on reinforcement of the Baltics based on that A2AD if it's never been enacted? Is it truly a coercive force short of war, and then does it become an active and capable force if we have fighting beginning? We need to understand what we think the denied in this is. We need to understand how we're going to address Kaliningrad. We need to understand, will we begin the flow of reinforcing forces if all of a sudden all the radars light up in Kaliningrad? And frankly, just one more time back to the well, how we would address the A2AD in Kaliningrad without the airspace of Finland and Sweden would really change the way we fight in the Baltic Sea. And so once again, these are things I believe we need to sit down and discuss with our great partners in the North. As was mentioned, in an air and in a ground sense, there's much to do. We're getting better at the joint land piece through the EFP. But I would offer that we're doing pretty good on the battalion structures of the EFP ground force. But what we have not yet addressed is those structures that provide the additional capabilities, the enablers to make those ground forces capable. Do we have the ISR, Intelligence, Surveillance, Reconnaissance, or ISTAR as NATO likes to call it? Do we have that in place? Do we have the long-range precise fires in place? And on everybody's mind recently, what is the ground-based air defense capability picture? And having talked to all three of those nations in my last 2.5 weeks, we've got a long way to go to understand how we would, in a joint manner, in a multinational manner, in a regional manner, as the report talks about, how do we do this air defense? And I think there's a long way to go. Again, the first and hardest problem is how do we connect also to our northern neighbors, Finland and Sweden? And what are the policies that would allow us to understand how we would employ air defenses just against fixed wing would be hard enough, but then to discuss fixed or ballistic missile defense would make it even harder. Okay, and I'm about a minute over where I needed to be, so I'm going to close with this. There's much to celebrate about what has happened good from Wales and Warsaw. The EFP is in place, and the nations are very excited and happy about that EFP. We all understand that there are enablers that need to go. But as it relates to both the agreements we made in Wales and then later in Warsaw, we need to stand to our commitment. We need to make sure that we don't begin to have sourcing gaps like we did in Afghanistan. We need to make sure that we show the commitment of our alliance and the nations in the alliance by a good fill and scheduling process that ensures that we have the forces in place that are there now. But that doesn't answer the mail. We still have the air and maritime to do. That's a do-out. We've got work to do. Probably the most concerning to me, though, is that we made commitments, primarily at Warsaw, but they started in Wales, that we were going to work more deeply and more collaboratively on planning, multinational planning, regional planning, and characterizing and understanding command and control, and how Multinational Core Northeast plays into this, how the individual nations plan into this, how the new types of plans that NATO has authorized plan into this, I see as one of the biggest pieces of work yet to do. These will not happen easily. They were hard enough to get in the agreement, and now we have to put our backs to the wheel and make sure that we begin to move forward in these things. I can tell you that in talking to the nations, there's quite a bit of uneasiness about the progression towards understanding what is the C2 arrangement. What is the progression towards understanding what the plans actually mean? And who will come and how this works. And frankly, we still have some work to do to better plan collaboratively among the nations so that one nation's plan doesn't create an issue for another nation in its defense. So to wrap up, I think that there's much to celebrate. I think there's some great ideas in this report, and I see some great consonance with things that we've said in the past. Lots to do here. We still have leftover work in NATO from what we agreed at Wales and Warsaw, and I think we need to press on that very hard to our nation's leadership. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, General Breedlove, for those terrific remarks to get us started here today, and thank you to all of you for coming. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm a senior fellow here in the Europe program, and I'm really delighted to have the chance to moderate this expert panel. Let me do introductions, and then we'll get started. To my left, Dr. Kathleen Hicks, Senior Vice President, CSIS. She is the Henry Kissinger Chair and the Director of the International Security Program. She was also the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense in the Obama administration, which, if I understand correctly, included the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance, as well as the 2010 QDR. So someone with a lot of experience in defense strategy within the Pentagon. And then to her left, Admiral Mark Ferguson, who was the commander of U.S. naval forces in Europe and U.S. naval forces for Africa, as well as being the Joint Forces Commander in Naples. And before that, the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, which was the end of a 38-year career in the U.S. Navy. So we've got a really great panel here who can look at this from multiple perspectives. So with that, Kath, I wanted to turn to you first and ask, how do you are also on the Commission for the National Defense Strategy.
True.
And so how do you connect to the issues General Breedlove was talking about in this report to the NDS and the National Security Strategy?
Thanks very much, Jeff. Great report to Heather, to the team. And as General Breedlove was saying in his introductory remarks, I think I will repeat many of the things that have already been covered here. I'm going to try not to. The National Defense Strategy, the National Security Strategy, they both speak a lot about competition and the renewed emphasis that we're seeing from Russia and China on competition with the United States. And certainly in Northern Europe, we're seeing that played out. So that definitely resonates. The form of that competition is a very broad spectrum. It includes, in the case of Russia, it certainly includes the strategic capabilities set to include nuclear weapons, and goes all the way in through the unconventional and political warfare approaches that we're all very familiar with at this point. And how does this intersect in Northern Europe in a way that is, strategically important? I think what I would pick that hasn't already been said, because I think there are a lot of great things that have already been said, is just to remind everyone that, from a Russian perspective, our center of gravity is our political cohesion. It's the cohesion of the West. And here you're looking at a region of the world where we are crossing multiple alliance seams, bilateral agreement seams, information sharing seams, seams between the undersea, the surface, the air, the land, again, all on different information channels, some of which are very closely held by certain parties, notably the US Navy. That's a pretty tempting target set if you're Russia, if what you want to do is prove the West can't get its act together. So these issues of C2, or maybe put more generally, cohesion and ability to have a unified approach in Northern Europe, as it is true throughout all the issues the Transatlantic Alliance and its partners deal with, is incredibly important. So I guess what I would say is that it fits into the NDS very much in terms of highlighting how they may want to play the seams if they're Russia, or how they may want to break consensus if they're Russia. And so it puts a real imperative on figuring out some of these concrete steps the United States ought to be taking To the capability set that they're presenting, I think General Breedlove did a great job, to say the least, running through that. But just as a reminder, cyber, space, electronic warfare, what is our presumption of permissiveness, if you will, particularly in the Baltic region, where we can very much expect this A2AD envelope from the Russians to deny us that permissibility, and yet we're very slow as a alliance and with our partners to make the needed improvements to operate in a non-permissive environment. So I'll leave it there just to say I think what we want to do is increase the risks to Russia of thinking about taking any kind of coercive action in this region, and certainly have the capabilities to defeat that kind of coercive action as an alliance with its Finnish and Swedish partners.
And if I could draw you out a little bit more on the seam in particular between allies and partners. It's a phrase that if you read the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, it's almost as if it's one word, allies and partners, allies and partners. You very rarely see one without the other. But of course, these are different concepts. And so how would you look at this particular seam between allies and partners and how we can collaborate? And to what degree is that an impediment?
Well,
does it have to be?
There are many layers to that. I think the one I think is most important, and I tried to highlight, is the information sharing piece, the intelligence sharing piece. There are issues even inside the alliance, Five Eyes versus non-Five Eyes is an obvious example, that are limiting to our ability to share. It's compounded by the fact then that you have partners who are critical, in this case Sweden and Finland, to defense and action more generally in the region, who help you to understand the commercial and military laydown, particularly in the maritime, but also in the air. And they have to be part of that unified picture. It's what General Breedlove referred to as sort of COP, or domain awareness across the region. So I think the first and foremost issue is how well we share information to the extent that it can create that common picture. And there I think the divide in particular between NATO and partner, although there are issues even beyond that, is probably the most fundamental one to take on right away. A command and control structure is a good way, if you will, top down, to get to the information picture that you need, because you force then hopefully an information sharing arrangement that gets you what you need.
Okay. And if I could ask one last question before we bring Admiral Ferguson into the conversation. Undersea warfare, maritime domain awareness are areas where you and your program have done a lot of work lately. And I wonder if you could comment in particular on the undersea warfare element of this and how you see that across the region.
So I don't want to paint the Russians as 10 feet tall, but they have been investing well in undersea warfare among their naval programs. It's the naval program they've invested in the most, and they are advancing in capability in ways that we just were not pacing toward, I think is the best way to put it, as an alliance. So there's a long way to go in terms of, again, being ready for a truly non-permissive environment in which obviously the Russians would try to operate in an undetected way, operate in ways that include use of special operations forces and other unconventional approaches that we might not be thinking about, and that can operate across, can even see within the challenges of the Baltic Sea, for example, but then can see across the capacity to have the swath that is Northern European waters covered by the alliance. So I think it's tremendously challenging. The Kola Peninsula, obviously, for the Russians is incredibly important for their fleet. That's a lot of naval assets, if you will, including undersea capability to track. And the alliance is very stretched, and the U.S. brings the most capacity, and it has a lot of other parts of the world it's looking at, which puts a real premium on developing capabilities from European countries themselves.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kath. Mark, with that segue, perhaps I'd ask you to any further thoughts in that regard?
No, I think that as the report contributes to the debate that's been taking place within NATO since about the 2013-14 period, when we saw the increase in the submarine activity and we saw an integrated exercise program, you then follow through into the firings of caliber missiles from the Caspian Sea to Syria, and even now testing those missiles in the Black Sea as they did last fall. And so this this moment, and the report contributes to what I like to think of as NATO rediscovering its maritime identity. If you look at the earliest part of the alliance, we would run exercises of 40, 50,000 sailors in the defense of Norway and amphibious operations. Very significant ASW mission in the North Atlantic that in the post-Cold War period, we dismantled much of that infrastructure, the training, the exercises, the proficiency. And so I think what you'll see coming out of the summit this summer is a renewed maritime strategy, more focus on investment in the maritime, both command and control and capability and capacity within NATO. The announcement of an Atlantic command, I think, is a step in the right direction. And I think that what I really look to is can you know, what's important in the maritime domain, what we've seen, to build on what Kath has said, is that this Russian emphasis on speed and movement backed up by a robust nuclear capability and their A2AD defenses really puts a premium on deterrence by denial as opposed to waiting for events to happen and relying on deterrence by punishment. So I think in the deterrent posture in the maritime field, you're going to see greater investments by the NATO nations in that. And I think this report contributes to that debate.
Okay. You took office as commander of naval forces in Europe just after the Russian invasion of Crimea and eastern Ukraine. And so perhaps you're uniquely positioned to comment on the changing relationship with Sweden and Finland and NATO. And on the U.S. side, could you reflect a little bit on, on that?
In my travels, I had the opportunity to visit Sweden, as Phil did, meet with their chief of defense and their chief of the Navy, extensive experience in Norway and in the Baltic countries. You know, I think there's opportunity for bilateral information sharing within the constructs of, you know, the classification levels and security. I think we have to be mindful in this realm, as Kath alluded to, there's really tiers of capability within the naval constructs in Europe. I would put at the very top end the nuclear deterrent powers who are intent on safeguarding their SSBN operating areas and, you know, those ASW operations. And then you move down into very capable navies, and then you have some at the very bottom that are very small and have limited capability. I think the important work that, you know, particularly in the Baltic, is how do we increase the capability as well as the capacity, because the speed of these events, if they do occur, will be so rapid that it'll be the forces that are present there. Because it's really an area, if you look, throw the geography map on and being land enclosed, it's an air driven environment, missile, diesel submarine type environment, which really is going to drive what forces you have up there. And
where do you see, you started off by talking about information sharing. Are there other areas where you see the potential for an intensified relationship to bear fruit?
I think
in operational terms in particular.
The great ability of naval forces, and particularly we see this in NATO, is that when they show up in international waters, they have the data links, the command and control, they can share the crypto for information sharing and a common operating picture seamlessly, whether it's via a ship. You know, any NATO ally will show up and you can instantly integrate standard operating procedures. And so anything that we can do with those countries to bring them seamlessly to integrate into that, I think would be a worthwhile investment.
Okay. You know, General Breedlove in his remarks talked about the policy, the need as sort of the first thing that we need for an enhanced cooperation and enhanced deterrence in the North. You know, there are of course policy issues. There are also technical issues. You spoke to this a bit, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to say a few more words about that if you'd like. I mean, to what degree do you see this as policy driven, and how much of the impediment do you see as technical?
I think in the technical standpoint, there obviously is a need for greater investment. And I think unmanned vehicles, undersea vehicles in that environment would be terrific. I think investment in the data links, the command and control platforms, and other capabilities in the Baltic in a regional basis would be very worthwhile. From a policy standpoint, you always have to remember that, particularly in the undersea domain, because of the very high investment that nations make in operating submarines and that infrastructure, that those secrets are some of the most preciously guarded ones. And so there will be always barriers to information sharing in certain domains. similar to like missile defense and other very high-tech areas where you have limits on sharing. But I think it's reasonable on a regional basis to form that type of information sharing, which then could plug into NATO in a seamless manner, as the report recommends to Germany.
General Breedlove, I want to turn to you on that as well.
I would just add a little along the following lines, and I think Mark would agree. At the tactical level, ship to ship, airman to airman, airplane to airplane, Finland and Sweden are very interoperable.
Yeah.
In fact, frankly, they're more interoperable than a few of our own allies who haven't progressed as far in their sort of recapitalization of equipment. So that, I think, is the less worrisome part. The bigger part is what you said. The long pole in the tent is the policy to begin to do the things that you use the words seamlessly integrate. I use flip the switch.
Yeah.
You know, we have something happening right now in the northern Baltic Sea. Bam, I need a joint combined COP on the maritime and in the air. Can we do that? And unless we have the policies that allow us to do the exercising and the testing, et cetera, and we have the political will from both sides to do that, I think Mark and others who study this kind of thing in the audience will tell you, even when you have the same kit, it doesn't always work that well if you don't exercise it and make sure, oh, we got the right fill, we got this, there, or the other. Until you get down to making it work, you can't count on it working. And so we need to make that step to choose to move forward and make it seamless or flip of the switch.
Right, and I think what's inherent in that is, as you said, is that there's a political decision that has to be taken in order for that to happen. But the last thing a policymaker wants to be told is that there's a technical impediment. I mean, it's in a way enabling a political decision maker to decide or not decide on cooperation in any particular event. General Breedlove, if we could also come back to the command structure, which Admiral Ferguson alluded to, and you spoke to as well. The emphasis on jointness you talked about. How do you see the location or the shape of a new Joint Force Command contributing to a more seamless response?
So I'm retired and I'm no longer the SACEUR and I have a little bit more freedom. But the bottom line is I think that the good news is that NATO has enough C2. It's how do we repurpose and reorient existing C2. Yeah. I've been pretty vocal that we don't need new bricks and mortars, new flags, new generals, etc. We have what we need to do and try to reorient it. It's also fairly obvious to all of us that through these periods of where we were trying to, and we should still be, by the way, don't misjudge what I'm about to say, but we had a period where we were trying to make a partner or we had some word to describe what we were trying to effect with Russia. And during that time, we very much have taken our eyes off of the Atlantic and the North Atlantic. We all understand what's coming out of the Northern Fleet in Russia and so forth, but we weren't looking at it in such an adversarial way. And I'm not sure that we should now, but the point being that we have had our eyes off to a certain degree. Our ability to reforge, our ability to move strategically across the ocean. And so I think that we need to refocus on that. And I do believe that there is enough structure in NATO to repurpose, to fit the new mission and put a renewed emphasis on our ability to think of the North Atlantic and the Atlantic as contested space, as opposed to what we've thought about it for some 2 decades of it being a permissive space.
I think many people in the audience will have picked up on your use of the word reforge, and that makes me
some of us are old.
Think about the question of exercises, and how do you see the role of exercises changing? And if I guess correctly that you're going to say more, better.
Yeah,
I'm
what does that
mean
excited.
Less of? What does that mean less of?
Yeah. So I'm excited, first of all, about exercises and frankly give NATO some credit even before Crimea. when we were trying to figure out what we were going to look like as we were coming out of Afghanistan, force coming down, what was going to be the raison d'etre for NATO, what was going to keep us glued together. And we decided at that time before Crimea that we had sort of lost our large force employment capability. We had stopped thinking about fighting the big multi-corps, multinational fight. And so it was at that time that we reoriented the first Trident juncture. The world tried to describe that reorientation as being a result of Crimea, and that was factually incorrect. We made that decision before Crimea. And so I think that we figured it out that we needed to regain the large force skills on the air, the land, and the sea. And we had gotten away from those. And so I'm excited that our exercises are becoming more stressful to looking at those larger problems. Command and control, logistics, communications, policy, for instance, the Schengen zone that was mentioned, our retired UCOM or USAR commander, Ben, couldn't have been more vocal about the need to rapidly move across the European land space. And so we forgot those skills, and we need to keep after them. So what do we do less of? I don't sign up to that we have to do less of anything else to do better exercises.
So it means more comprehensive and more with greater strategic focus.
That's correct.
Rather than
and
simply doing
more stressful.
Okay.
We need to pick forces up and move them.
Right.
We need to sail. We need to fly at force level that tests us. We're really good at flying a two-ship to a particular place over Nangarhar and putting precise weapons on target. We're really good at prosecuting one set of targets through the oceans into the Med and wherever they're going. We're good at these things that are, I would say, are tough skills-wise, but don't test us volume-wise. And we need to think a little more about, can we react, move, shoot, and scoot at the size that would be required in one of these contests.
Okay. I want to turn in just a minute to the audience and get some questions to spark further conversation. But before I do, I wanted to ask one last question. General Breedlove and Kath and Mark, if you want to comment, please do. We've seen increasing number of incidents and increasingly dangerous incidents between Russian forces, especially Russian aircraft, and U.S. aircraft, both most recently above the Black Sea in international airspace, but also in the Baltic Sea. Help us interpret this. To what degree do you think this is signaling? To what degree is it foolhardiness? And how much do you expect this to continue to characterize the sort of standoff with Russian forces?
So I would never characterize it as foolhardiness. Frankly, I think we have watched a Russian military force that has matured in a great way since Georgia. What they learned in Georgia, they did much better in Crimea. What they did in Crimea, had problems with, they did much better in Donbass. And then we saw new and exciting things in Syria. This is a learning, adaptive force, and I don't think that anything that's happening out there is foolhardiness. And I know you were just generating conversation, but
sure.
just I think these are actions that are taken via decision and via policy and in a way to try to ratchet pressure up on pressure points. Two, I think we absolutely need to begin much more meaningful conversations with Russia about all manner of things. The Navy started a long time ago, Ink Sea.
Yeah.
We've sort of glommed on to Ink Sea and turned that into Ink Land and Ink Air. We discuss all kinds of things, but it's still sort of focused on the maritime. We need to have a broader way to handle things like what we saw in northern Syria, southern Turkey, and how we sort things out when we're flying in a bellicose manner in the same airspace, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and now I'm going to say something that sounds political, and it's not. But inside this beltway, we are so wrapped around Russia and our former election that we can't seem to get our eyes up off of our feet and think about there are larger, more important conversations that we need to be having with Russia. And I think this discussion of ink, sea, air, and land is a good starting point. We need to be talking about loose fissile material. We need to be talking about loose nuclear material, non-fissile. There's a lot of things that we need to be having conversations with our Russian partners about that we can't have now because we're tied down in what I think a multi-partisan, bipartisan morass about the former election. And I think we just need to move out. We need to get moving on having more detailed and deep conversations with our Russian interlocutors to begin to address some of these. Sorry for getting on my bandwagon there a little bit.
Nonsense. Admiral Ferguson.
I would just say what we saw in the behavior off Kaliningrad and the Baltic, as well as in the Black Sea, I would just echo, it's definitely signaling. It's primarily directed at U.S. assets as opposed to other nations' assets because of the intelligence collection platforms and the capabilities of our destroyers. And I think it's taking a page from what's happening in the South China Sea. And so it's really an assertion of their belief that this is part of their defensive zone and to try and keep us out of it. So I think we continue to operate in accordance with international law.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Hicks?
I completely agree. I just would go back to my prior point that I think the challenge that we see from Russia is multidimensional, it's multi-domain, and the way it may manifest may look like conventional warfare. It's most likely to look like a combination of things. So I would just encourage the alliance along with Sweden and Finland to be thinking similarly as it orients itself, if you will, toward the future, toward how to think about the Russia of today and less of a mentality that might strike some as a return to a Russia of 1998 or 1988, excuse me.
Okay, thanks. All right, well, I'd like to turn to all of you in the audience, and what we'll do is take a few questions together and then give panelists an opportunity to respond. Just want to remind you, please state your name and your affiliation, and also appreciate questions rather than comments that are too lengthy because we want to make sure we have as much discussion as possible. So we'll start here in the front. We'll start here and then we'll come.
Lauri Lepik, Estonian ambassador to US. Thanks very much for the report. I think I will dive into it and read all the details. The question really is, we spoke about the northern group, the region, and I fully subscribe to that. We didn't speak about US role in integration of this region and the role of either political or military of the US in achieving all those goals. Could you comment?
Okay, thank you. Harlan.
I'm Harlan Ullman with a number of places around here. Phil Breedlove, I think, raised a critical point. Without reading the report, it seems to me that there are three missing items. The first and probably most important is having a discussion with the Russians over a manner of things. The second is the word nuclear never appears. Mm-hmm. Both of us, both the Americans and the Russians, are rebuilding their nuclear forces. The nuclear posture review came out. You could easily see an arms race. But as important, as you know, the Russian doctrine really is plagiarizing flexible response with escalating to de-escalate, where the Russians have a huge advantage in theater local nuclear weapons, which have not been mentioned. And finally, nobody talked about active measures. It seems to me if NATO is not going to address these three issues, we can talk about deterrence, but I think we're missing key points in the future that are going to be essential in turning our relations in a more positive direction. Comments?
Okay, thanks. Ma'am.
Good afternoon, Pascal Siegel from Ankara Consulting. So at the start, you put up this great map and you showed the Sea of Barents, but I have not heard the word Arctic. Right. So is there a role for NATO in the Arctic, and if yes, what is it?
Okay, thanks. So
Well, I think I'll take the first. I think I did address Harlan's pieces in mine, so I'll skip that. I will defer on the Arctic to others, and I will address that first question on the U.S. role as integrator, because I do think this is a constant tension that arises where we hear, when we travel in the region, when we talk to experts in the region, thinking through how best to orchestrate, if you will, a unified approach. It's clear that there is a longing for the United States to serve that integration role in order to galvanize the unity. The United States, in turn, has by and large often thought of Northern Europe as one of the most capable regions, with a good amount of investment from many of its countries, key players, the UK, Norway, Finland, Sweden, et cetera, who can contribute to an advanced capability. And it has largely taken less of a major role, if you will, than it has in other areas. And I don't see that tension resolving, I'll be frank with you. I mean, I think if I were just trying to be polite, I would say absolutely, the US needs to be the integrator, and that's where we need to go, and case done, and on to Brussels. And I think that's true. I very much worry about getting from here to there. I do think the Atlantic Command decision is a way to help tie the United States, if you will, back in thoroughly, at least on the North Atlantic piece of it. And I do think some of the opportunities that are arising and are raised in the report with regard to different command and control arrangements, and also, for instance, the German center in Rostock and other areas that allow for integration, are opportunities for the United States to re-engage more fully than they have. So I think that the US goodwill is there, but the capacity and the emphasis maybe are not so much focused on Northern Europe as Northern Europe would like.
Mm-hmm. I'll take the Arctic question briefly. At the political level, there's disagreement within the alliance about the role of NATO in the Arctic, and hence you haven't seen a great emphasis on that. There are some nations that believe that the principal focus in the Arctic should be the environment, safety, and economic issues, and security falls below that threshold at the present. And so you're seeing through the Arctic Council and then individual nations starting to look at actions in that realm as opposed to collectively through NATO. I think that two factors will perhaps change that. First is the construction of a series of Russian military bases along the Arctic in the north. There are disputes potentially over territorial claims there. And the fact that with the passages open across Northern Europe, I believe COSCO sailed a freighter from China across the north into Europe, shortening the transit time going around. So those factors over time with economic development and this may bring the security element back in, but I don't see it at present in the NATO agenda.
So, Mr. Ambassador, this is going to sound like a proud American commander, and maybe that's because I'm a proud American commander, but I would like to think that what we see now in EFP was largely, the conversation was started and facilitated by what America did, putting the companies in, the response to bring airplanes, to open up the more air policing in the north, et cetera, et cetera. And so why do I bring that up? I think it speaks to the fact that the United States has a role in maybe helping lead to that integration in the north. And I would hope that we would embrace that role. To the Arctic, I agree with everything that's said, but let me just say that I think even though there are some things that look nefarious happening at air bases and ports and things in the north, we should still embrace the Arctic as an opportunity economically. I mean, I'm not a sailor, but I've heard anywhere from 14 to 24 days difference in transit time, right, depending on the type of hull and the cargo and so forth. That is a huge economic opportunity. So maybe this is one of the places where we can begin to have a fruitful conversation with the Russians about how can we do this without getting at each other and facilitate, because if your economy gets better, mine's probably going to get better too. Let's find an opportunity as opposed to a place to be opposed here. To Harlan's 3 points, let me just say that I do believe as I said, we have to begin some level of conversation with Russia. I'm an engineer. Our vector is bad. If we don't apply an opposing force and direction, it's not going to get better. And so we've got to do something. On the nukes thing, let me go at it in a different way than you did. I have a great fear. I personally believe that Russia has violated the INF. I think probably we get a lot of agreement in this crowd. And my fear is that we lose the INF because of the direction, the vector that this is going. If we lose INF, you have heard Russians say, and I have heard Russians say in not too distant talks, that a new start follows. We don't want the unraveling of our nuclear agreements, I do not think. And so we've got to begin some conversation to figure out what is the path ahead to this challenge to INF so that the dominoes don't begin to kick. That's Phil Breedlove's personal opinion, not one of anybody in this government. And then the last thing I would say is, you're right, active measures. In fact, I've heard a new term being used inside this beltway called societal war as a sort of very unique piece of active measures where actors, we believe from Russia, entered in and excited people on the very far right and excited people on the very far left to create problems. The attack is on Western civilization, society, democratic values, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And so active measures are now morphing into other things. And if we don't begin to think about how we're going to address them with all the tools of government, I think we will continue to be, as the Army likes to say, shooting behind the target.
I would just add to that, I think this is clearly an area where there needs to be a political engagement. This is not primarily a military problem, but it's one that requires intense political engagement at the highest levels. We're going to take a second round of questions over on this side. So let's come up to the front. Peter Michael, and then we'll take...
Hi, I'm Steve Winters, independent consultant. You mentioned the maturing of the Russian military through these various engagements with Georgia and going on and up now through Syria. Obviously, the Russians are saying that this has given them a level of practical experience which they couldn't have gotten in any exercises. And I think in his summary of the Syrian operation, Defense Minister Shoji said they had discovered 702 defects in their military equipment, which then they've now hopefully working on fixing. He thought they were doing a good job, the industrial base, in fixing it. So what is the plan to balance that advantage which they've gotten through these active engagements?
Peter Michael? Turn to your left, Peter Michael. You got a mic on the other side of you. Okay.
Thank you very much. Peter Michael Nielsen, Danish Defense Counselor. Two questions, one more directed for Admiral Ferguson on the question of deterrence by denial. What more sort of kind of measures would you like to see in a way in this area so that we could secure that and maybe again bringing in comfortably a fleet in the Baltic Sea in a crisis situation? And probably mainly to General Breedlove. On the C2 structure, you talked about the new Joint Forces Command headquarters, which is obviously a key C2 or will become a key C2 structure. But I heard from your comments that there also needed to happen something on lower levels. So if you could elaborate on that, if there are other kind of C2 arrangements that maybe needs to be elaborated and further developed. Thank you.
And third question, John Heffern.
Thanks to CSIS, Heather and Jeff, great report. I want to dig into a little bit on the land. John Heffern, formerly state EUR, now detailed to Georgetown. On the land piece, recently the RAND study is pretty clear, 7 brigades in the Balts to deter the Russians. SEPA's got a big report on frontline allies, also brigades in the Balts and in Poland. Your 4-brigade recommendation is not specific on location. Is it because if we do the maritime and air piece right and the 4 brigades are permanent somewhere in Europe, we don't need them on the Russian border? Or is it because you don't want to suggest something that's going to upset alliance solidarity and maybe undermine our political will? Where do you want the 4 brigades to go, and do they need to be on in the Balts?
Okay, thanks. We'll work this direction this time.
Okay.
So, General Breedlove.
Okay, I've been talking too much, so I'm going to try to let some of this to someone else. So I love RAND. In fact, we got some great RAND people sitting here, so I'm being very careful. But the way you formulated your sentence, you said they have determined that it would take 7 brigades to deter Russia. Is that really what they said? I mean, because frankly, some will tell you that Russia is deterred right now with 3 EFP battalions forward. Now, I don't know which is right, but the point is, I don't know that there's any magic in any of these, and I love the work that Dave Monick and others do, and I need to read this report because I haven't read that one yet. But the bottom line is, I'm not sure that the number is 7, and I'm not sure that the number is 4. Here's what I do believe, and you've heard this before, no magic, that deterrence is in the mind of those deterred.
Exactly.
So where do we put the question in Mr. Putin's head about if he comes across the line, he's going to face the full alliance? And so I think that there's art there. It's not all math, and we need to consider that. As far as the 4 brigades in Europe, again, I don't know that that number is exactly right. But what I do know, and I've testified to and said many times, is we don't have the force over there now that we need. But frankly, we're not going to ever move another brigade from America to Europe unless it's a brand new brigade. How do you think we're going to convince any 2 senators, several congressmen, 1 governor, and several mayors that we're about to uproot 40,000 households out of their state and move them somewhere? I think it's a fool's errand to think about that. If we're not going to grow the Army, we're not going to get bigger in Europe. And so the question is, where do these brigades come from? So I get past that conversation. I believe we need to look at what is it that we have over there and what do we need? As I said in my opening remarks, I believe that there's a big chunk of enabler discussion that was sort of agreed to in Wales and Warsaw that have yet to come to fruition. We've got 3 EFP battalions over there. Do they have the air defense they need? I can tell you the answer is no. Do they have the fire support surface to surface that they need? No. Do they have the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance that they need? No. These are all my opinion, but I would venture to say there's wide acceptance of those particular opinions. And so I believe that there's a lot of places where we can go first before we get to those large formations, which would mean that we have to grow our military force to get to them. I've just offered you Phil Breedlove's opinion, nobody else's.
On the deterrence by denial piece, when you start to break that into components, and I'll take it in the maritime realm with that I'm most familiar with, you're looking at imposing a cost on your potential adversaries, such that, as Phil talked about, the question in their mind is, can I actually achieve my objectives without such a high cost? And so if you pick, maritime environment in the Baltic, for example, or off the coast of Norway in the North Atlantic, it really goes down to how robust, and it requires additional investment from where we are today. I echo that from Phil, is how robust is your threat and warning capabilities so that you know that the other forces are moving? How rapidly can you resupply and move your own forces to be in place? Are there elements involved that present speed bumps or barriers to their execution and planning that you can move pretty rapidly? And in this type of confined maritime environment, diesel submarines would provide that, coastal patrol boats with cruise missiles would provide that, rapid response air would provide that. And so the adversary would have to see that not only do you have that capability, but you've exercised it, you're proficient in it, and it can respond quickly. And so that requires a change in the mindset. When you look at mobilization times that NATO has now, let's talk about 60 days or 180 days in order to move forces. That's a complete change of mindset that requires an investment as well as a doctrine change to go forward.
2 fingers there.
2
and it'll come to your
nanosecond
cap.
readdress. Did the RAND report say defend versus deter? You said 7 brigades to deter.
It's to deter.
What did it say,
I think it
Kath?
said to deter.
Yeah. So your question to me was 7 brigades to deter, and that's kind of why I teed off a little bit on the deterrence. I think it was 7 brigades to defend.
I think it's to deter.
If you remember Ochmonek's work some years ago, it was about how little time it was going to take to get to the water, and then the follow-on work was, well, it's going to take 7 brigades to defend, and so that's a different. I teed off a little bit, and I'm sorry, but I think it's the D word. Were you talking defend or deter? So I answered the deter question.
All right.
Okay.
Let me take the Russia learning and deterrence bite and L pieces together, only to add to what's been said to say, yes, it's quite regrettable, maybe is the mildest way to put it, that the Russians have had the opportunity for a living laboratory for their experimentation. But they, like we often worry about ourselves, have largely operated in an environment that was not denied. And so back to the points that Mark was making, there are ways for the West to increase the costs on Russia in ways that were not, that they have not successfully proven themselves through in these series of operations that they have undertaken. So very worrisome, but again, let's not make them 10 feet tall. They're not 10 feet tall. There are problems, and there are problems inside their funding stream and their acquisition base. I never count the Russians out. I hope I didn't all through the 90s, but I do count them as a little bit down, and we ought to take advantage of that. They have a center of gravity just like we do. On the 7 brigades to deter, I do think it was deter. Let me first
Defend,
say,
Kath, or deter?
I think it was to deter. Let me first say there is no analyst that I respect more in this world than David Ochmonek, having worked closely with him for the 8 years of the Obama administration. But coming away from that, let's step out of the perspective of that particular piece of RAND work, which had a purpose that, a client who asked a question and got a direct answer. The bigger issue to me gets to, the concept for the campaign, right? And here I think we fall too often back to these Cold War paradigms. It's sort of conventional, followed by a nuclear if we cross that threshold. The Russians, that's not where they are doctrinally anymore. And Kaliningrad, I think even the RAND study would point to, would be inherently involved in any kind of exchange over Baltic. In that case, it's a Baltic scenario, Baltic Seas scenario. Seizing, that is, not the seas. In that kind of scenario, why wouldn't the Russians go nuclear if the United States attacked Kaliningrad? Right? These are the kinds of questions we need to be asking. There would be a space fight, there'd be a cyber fight, there'd be probably a strategic weapons fight to be discussed. That's the way we need to be thinking about war in the future, not, I'm very in favor of forward stationing of ground forces. I think we need to keep our conventional deterrence strong. Keeping our conventional deterrence strong is driving them below the level of conventional. That's good, but then we have to also get capable there. But let's not reduce this to the size of the Army, the capacity overall of the Navy. These are all implicated, but we need to think differently about this challenge set because it won't look the way we expect.
Yeah, and Phil and I argued very strongly for NATO had kept its hands off cyber use for many years, but I think in the last ministerial meeting they approved cyber tools for commanders' use in conflict, and so that becomes part of it. It will go multidimensional, and the problem of attribution in these things will be probably the most difficult one as you start.
If I could just add one, John, in response to your question, I think another thing that brought us to the conclusion about forward stationing is the enormous cost of the current rotation of heavy brigades. Now, there may be other ways to address that problem, but somewhere around 40% of the ERI money is spent to move equipment back and forth, which is significant, and there's a real learning process to it. But over time, I think that's something that we think needs to be looked at.
And I think that's one of the arguments that I hear that is very good for pre-positioning forward in a more significant way. But if you pre-position forward and put it too far forward, you can lose it. If you put it in a place where you have to contend with A2AD to get to it, you've brought another problem. And so there's a lot of things we need to consider as we tweak that. But putting the heavy force forward and pre-positioning and rotating forces so that the BXs, Walmarts, gas stations, and all that stuff stay in America and keep everybody happy, but the forces fall in over there. That's a different matter, I think.
We have time for maybe just one last very short round of lightning questions, if I see any hands up. Is this a follow-up to, go ahead.
I'm sorry, since you give me the opportunity, I will take it. So Pascal Siegel at Ankara Consulting. You've mentioned the problem of, building up capabilities. I mean, the finance. Okay, we're all short on, on greens these days. Is there a role for the EU common defense policy in shoring up these defenses in the north?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. European Union defense policy, role you see.
I think that's Jeff, actually.
I'm the moderator, but I'll come to it.
The two NATO commanders are looking to their right.
Yeah,
well, my view on that would be that certainly anything that strengthens European contributions to defense, ultimately we share the same overarching objectives in defense. So we don't get into it in immense detail in the report, but you will see that the European Union role in defense is one that is growing. In our view, the United States should welcome that. I think, of course, it's important for those European Union efforts to yield defense capabilities that make an overall contribution to transatlantic security. And that they are leveraged in a way that is effective. But it's also important to remember the European Union has, in its own solidarity clause, an important political and potentially military instrument that relates to the security of Sweden and Finland. And therefore, the NATO-EU cooperation needs to connect with that as well. So I think the political dialogue between the United States and the European Union has to be sustained. The U.S. Military dialogue with the European Union is also important, and this needs to be part of a coordinated, coherent effort to raise transatlantic security. So with that, I think we will wrap up, and I would like, before handing the mic back to Heather Conley, just to thank our panelists, Phil Breedlove, Mark Ferguson, Kathleen Hicks, for your wonderful contributions today. But before, hold your applause, because Heather is going to take the mic back to round us out here.
Well, thank you. It's not on.
Just to thank our panelists so much, and I forgot to mention one outstanding colleague, Matt Molino, who's in the back, who's our research assistant extraordinaire, who was our anchor through this whole thing. And we would not be here today were it not for the generous support of Actagon, who made this research possible, and we are deeply grateful. We can write this in theory, but it takes the practitioners to tell us how it really works, and we couldn't be more grateful to have such partners and friends at CSIS to help us do this. The link is up there. Please read the report. We're trying to save trees and not print too many copies, but we hope to continue this dialogue, and we follow the NATO summit in July, and let's see if any of this will come out. So please thank our panel again. Thank you.